April 1945. Inside the wire of Bergen-Belsen, the liberation has transformed into a slow-motion massacre. 400 survivors are dying every single day, a casualty rate that exceeds the worst combat attrition of the entire Canadian campaign. Standard medical doctrine demands that these starving patients be stabilized in place because they are too fragile to move. However, in this specific hell, the safety rule is actually a death sentence. The camp itself is a biological weapon packed so densely that typhus reinfects patients faster than doctors can treat them. As a result, the British Medical Command has accepted that 30,000 more people will inevitably perish within 8 weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Dunkelman, a 28-year-old infantry officer with zero medical training, decides to break the only law that matters. He realizes that following the rules is committing murder. Therefore, he commandeers a fleet of enemy trucks to do the unthinkable load dying patients onto hard suspension vehicles and drive them 15 kilometers over cratered roads. The medical experts warn him that the vibration alone will stop their hearts. Dunkelman knows that if he is wrong, he will face a court-martial for slaughtering the people he came to save. But if he is right, he will rewrite the laws of survival. The engines are idling, the stretchers are loaded, and the first convoy is about to test whether a rough road is safer than a hospital bed. If you want to follow how this moment unfolds, so stay with us and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's return to the beginning. April 15th, 1945, Northern Germany. When the tanks of the British 11th Armored Division crushed the perimeter fence of Bergen-Belsen, the crews braced for an ambush. Instead, they encountered a silence so profound, it drowned out the roar of their engines. Then came the smell of physical wall of decay and untreated disease that forced hardened combat veterans to vomit inside their steel turrets. They believed they had arrived to end the horror, but they quickly realized the killing was far from over. Inside the wire, 60,000 prisoners drifted through the mud-living skeletons who had survived the Nazi extermination machine, only to face a new invisible enemy. In the first 7 days following liberation, 400 people died every 24 hours. They did not die from gas chambers mechanisms of industrial slaughter that did not exist at this specific camp, but from catastrophic neglect and the biological shock of rescue. The British medical teams immediately deployed standard relief protocols because that was what their doctrine demanded. They distributed water and standard army rations to the starving crowds. This act of mercy proved lethal. The prisoners had survived on less than 400 calories a day for months, an intake barely sufficient to fuel a resting heartbeat, let alone a working body. As a result, their digestive systems had completely atrophied. When they consumed solid food, their bodies went into shock. When they drank normal quantities of water, their weakened hearts failed under the sudden fluid load. The liberators watched in horror as the people they had just saved died in their arms. Typhus, a bacterial disease spread by lice, raged through the overcrowded barracks unchecked. The medical officers, men expertly trained to treat battlefield trauma, found themselves professionally paralyzed. Their standard tools were useless against a humanitarian disaster of this magnitude. They sat in their command tents and calculated the trajectory. Based on the persistent daily death rate, they projected that 30,000 more people would die within the next 8 weeks. To the senior medical command, that these future deaths were a tragic mathematical certainty. The infrastructure was destroyed, the supply lines were overstretched, and the patients appeared too far gone for intervention. They concluded that the standard of care was the only option, even if that standard resulted in mass graves. The system accepted this horror because the rulebook offered no alternative. The senior medical staff men with decades of experience reviewed the projections and nodded in grim agreement. To them, the loss of another 30,000 lives was not a failure of medicine, but an unavoidable consequence of biology. They reasoned that the prisoners were simply too weak to survive the recovery process. However, Lieutenant Colonel Ben Dunkelman viewed the disaster through a different lens. At only 28 years old, the Canadian officer possessed zero medical training, yet he carried the pragmatic, problem-solving mindset of an infantry commander who had fought across Europe. While the doctors focused on individual patient charts, Dunkelman walked the camp to analyze the logistics of the environment itself. What he saw was a structural death trap. In barracks designed to hold 10 soldiers, he counted over 50 prisoners, a density so extreme that the sick could not physically separate from the dead. Bodies lay interlocking on the floor, allowing typhus-infected lice to migrate freely from corpse to survivor. Outside, thousands of people queued for hours to access a single water pump, a bottleneck that meant the weakest died of dehydration before they could even reach the handle. Dunkelman realized that the camp itself was the pathogen. Therefore, treating patients inside this zone was futile, because the environment reinfected them faster than any doctor could cure them. He crunched the numbers in his notebook. The daily mortality rate stood at a staggering 12%, a statistic, implying that the entire population would be wiped out in weeks if they remained static. The conventional medical wisdom held that critically ill patients must be stabilized before transport. Dunkelman concluded the exact opposite. Because the stable environment was lethal, the only way to save the 30,000 remaining souls was to break the most sacred rule of combat medicine. He decided he must move the dying immediately. He formulated a plan to evacuate the sickest prisoners, first transporting them away from the contamination zone to clean facilities where they stood a fighting chance. It was a logistical solution to a medical problem requiring the transport of thousands of fragile bodies over ruined roads. When he prepared to present this concept, he knew he was walking into a firing squad of professional opinion. He was a junior officer telling chief surgeons to load critical patients onto trucks. The command tent smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion when Dunkelman walked in to challenge the entire medical hierarchy. He placed his folder on the table, interrupting a room full of British colonels who viewed him as an unqualified infantryman with zero medical training. When he outlined his proposal to evacuate the camp's population within a 72-hour window, a time frame necessary to outpace the typhus outbreak before it consumed everyone, the reaction was immediate and hostile. The senior medical officers slammed the idea as reckless, arguing that the physical stress of transport would kill patients who were already barely clinging to life. They insisted that moving critical cases over rough terrain was a death sentence. However, Dunkelman did not back down or appeal to emotion. Instead, he countered with cold arithmetic. He pointed out that keeping the patients in the current filth guaranteed a 12% daily mortality rate, a statistic that meant total extermination was a mathematical certainty. Therefore, he argued, even if the trauma of transport killed 3% of the patients on the road, the operation would still save the vast majority. It was a calculated trade-off that horrified the doctors who were trained to do no harm. But it made perfect sense to a soldier trained to accept casualties to secure a victory. The argument deadlocked until Brigadier Glenn Hughes, the Deputy Director of Medical Services, intervened. He looked at the charts and recognized that the standard approach was failing. As a result, he offered Dunkelman a compromise that carried the weight of a threat. The Canadian would get 500 patients, a sample size large enough to provide statistically significant results, and exactly 24 hours to prove his theory. His objective was to move them 15 kilometers to a set of abandoned German cavalry barracks that offered clean roofs and isolation. If the death rate during this test run exceeded the rate in the main camp, then the conversation would end, and Dunkelman would likely face disciplinary action. He accepted the terms, immediately fully aware that he had one day to prove that a bumpy truck ride was safer than a hospital bed. The preparation for the test run began in the dark hours of the morning. Dunkelman knew that placing starving bodies into vibrating trucks without biological fuel was a death sentence. Therefore, he enforced a rigid pre-transport protocol that treated food as medication. Each of the 500 selected patients consumed exactly 200 calories, an amount carefully divided into 6 small meals, to ensure their atrophied stomachs did not rupture. Medical staff strictly limited water intake to 0.5 liters every few hours because a sudden surge in fluid volume would simply stop their hearts. Once the patients were stabilized, orderlies loaded them into a mismatched column of commandeered ambulances and cargo trucks. They fit 20 patients per truck, packing them onto straw-lined floors with barely enough room to turn their heads. The convoy rolled out of the main gate and onto the cratered German countryside. The destination was only 15 kilometers away, a distance that a healthy unit could march in an afternoon. However, the condition of the roads turned this short trip into a 3-hour marathon of tension. The trucks moved at a walking pace to navigate the deep ruts left by Allied bombing and heavy armor. Inside the dark cargo bays, the patients felt every vibration. The drivers knew that a single violent jolt could induce fatal shock in their fragile passengers. As a result, the convoy crawled forward with agonizing slowness, the engines barely idling as they navigated the broken terrain. When they finally reached the clean zone, the risk became immediately visible. The destination was a complex of former German cavalry barracks that had been scrubbed down and prepped. Here, the patients were unloaded into rooms that offered 3 feet of space between beds, a simple geometric gap that broke the chain of lice transmission and allowed fresh air to reach their lungs. The contrast to the suffocating piles of humanity in the main camp was stark. The 500 test subjects were now clean-fed and isolated from the source of the infection. Yet the true success of the operation remained uncertain. The convoy had arrived, but the validity of Dunkelman's entire theory depended entirely on how many bodies the orderlies would find when the sun rose the next morning. Dawn broke over the German cavalry barracks, and the count began. The medical orderlies moved from bed to bed, checking pulses and breath in the quiet rooms. Of the 500 critically ill patients who had endured the agonizing 3-hour truck ride, only 15 had died during the night. This represented a 3% mortality rate, a number that was tragic, but statistically miraculous, given the condition of the passengers. Back at the main camp, the control group told a much darker story. Among a similar group of 500 patients who had remained in the stable environment of the infected barracks, 60 had perished in the same 24-hour window. This 12% mortality rate confirmed Dunkelman's grim hypothesis with absolute clarity. The data proved that keeping the patients static was 4 times more lethal than subjecting them to the stress of transport. Brigadier Hughes reviewed the reports in silence, staring at the discrepancy between the 2 columns of numbers. As a result, he looked at Dunkelman and issued a command that shifted the operation from a small experiment to a massive logistical offensive. He authorized the immediate evacuation of the entire remaining camp population. This directive meant moving 34,000 people, a staggering number, equivalent to emptying a small city, and doing it before the infection claimed them. The timeline, however, was brutal. To outpace the spreading typhus and the physiological collapse of the survivors, Hughes set a deadline of just 8 days. This required the movement of over 4,000 patients every single day, a throughput that would tax a fully equipped transport regiment operating under peacetime conditions. The immediate problem was physical capacity. The British Army simply did not have enough spare trucks or drivers to maintain that tempo without stripping frontline combat units. They needed hundreds of heavy vehicles and thousands of personnel to load, drive, and unload the cargo. The Allied motor pools were empty, stretched thin by the rapid advance into Germany. Therefore, Dunkelman realized he could not rely on his own army for the tools he needed. To move 4,000 people a day, he would need to find a fleet that did not technically exist on the Allied roster, so he decided to take them from the enemy. Dunkelman did not send a request form to headquarters because he knew the bureaucracy would kill the operation before it started. Instead, he simply took what he needed from the defeated enemy. He targeted a fleet size of 200 trucks, a number calculated to maintain a continuous rotation between the camp and the new safe zones. Ranging out into the chaotic countryside, he commandeered every functional German vehicle his team could find, seizing Wehrmacht ambulances, heavy supply lorries, and even civilian buses that had been abandoned by fleeing units. By the end of the day, he had assembled a ragtag armada of 187 vehicles, a mechanical force that existed completely outside the official Allied table of organization. However, trucks are useless without drivers and labor to load them. The Allied infantry were busy securing the sector, so Dunkelman turned to the only available manpower pool, the thousands of surrendered German soldiers sitting in holding pens. He conscripts 2,000 German POWs, men who had fought for the Third Reich days earlier, and issued them a new set of orders. The irony was absolute. Under the barked commands of a Jewish Canadian officer, Wehrmacht soldiers were forced to become the primary logistical engine for saving the victims of their own regime. They became drivers, stretcher bearers, and construction crews. Consequently, the roads around Bergen-Belsen transformed into a surreal theater, where the perpetrators physically carried the survivors to safety. Dunkelman used this captured force to weave a logistical web across a 50-kilometer radius, a distance sufficient to disperse the population and prevent cross-contamination between facilities. He identified and seized 12 distinct locations to serve as satellite hospitals. These included Wehrmacht barracks, requisition schools, and factory floors that could be scrubbed clean. He had zero permission from the British High Command to utilize enemy prisoners or captured property on this scale. Yet he understood that asking for authorization would incur delays, and delays were measured in corpses, with the fleet assembled and the labor force coerced into action. The operation launched, turning the roads around Belsen into a 24-hour conveyor belt of life support. To prevent the trucks from becoming rolling hearses, Dunkelman reconfigured the convoy into a mobile medical unit. He assigned one nurse per vehicle, a staffing ratio that ensured medical intervention could happen at 30 kilometers per hour. As the trucks bounced over the ruined roads, these nurses balanced on the floorboards, adjusting blankets and checking pulses. This turned the transport fleet into a rolling hospital, allowing treatment to continue uninterrupted during the critical gap between the infection zone and the safe zone. On the first full day of the expanded operation, the system surged beyond all expectations. The ragtag fleet moved 8,000 patients, a massive initial volume that cleared entire blocks of the main camp in a single shift. Consequently, the atmosphere in Bergen-Belsen began to shift immediately. As the population density dropped, the lice struggled to find new hosts, and the remaining medical staff could finally focus their attention on fewer patients. The operation soon settled into a relentless rhythm of 4,000 patients per day, a sustained throughput that required the German drivers to run continuous loops without rest. Dunkelman himself became the central nervous system of this sprawling network. He worked 20-hour duty days, sleeping in 15-minute bursts in the back of a command truck to remain constantly available for crisis management. He juggled fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and the complex allocation of supplies to the 12 satellite sites. These new facilities were soon operating at 300% capacity, filling corridors and common rooms with beds to match the relentless inflow. Despite this extreme overcrowding, the environment remained fundamentally different from the main camp. The air was clean, the water was fresh, and the patients were isolated from the source of the plague. The results of this logistical violence were undeniable. While the death rate in the main camp had been 12% daily, the mortality rate across the new network stabilized at 3%, proving that the stress of the journey was far less lethal than the stagnation of the camp. Thousands of lives were being saved by the simple act of movement. However, while the operation was a medical success, it was a bureaucratic crime, and the British High Command finally noticed. 3 days into the operation, the inevitable collision with military bureaucracy finally arrived. The urgent summons to headquarters pulled Dunkelman away from the dust and diesel fumes of the convoy line. He walked into a command office in May 1945 to face a tribunal of senior officers who were less concerned with the survival rates and more focused on the procedural violations. The charges were specific and severe. He stood accused of reckless endangerment for moving critical patients against medical advice, and of utilizing 2,000 unauthorized POWs, an act that technically constituted a breach of prisoner management protocols. The presiding general did not mince words. He reminded Dunkelman that he was an infantry officer, not a doctor, and that his medical experiments were a liability to the British Army. The threat of a court-martial hung heavy in the air, because the military functions on order, and Dunkelman had replaced order with improvised chaos. However, before the prosecution could formalize the proceedings, Brigadier Glenn Hughes stepped forward to intervene. He did not offer emotional appeals or character witnesses. Instead, he laid a single sheet of paper on the desk, wielding the raw data as his only weapon. Hughes recited the numbers that defined the reality on the ground. The daily mortality rate in the static camp had held firm at 12%. In contrast, the rate in Dunkelman's unauthorized network had dropped to 3%, a survival factor that invalidated every medical objection raised by the staff. As a result, Hughes projected that if the operation continued, they would save 28,000 lives that the official projection had already written off as dead. This stark comparison silenced the room. The generals could argue with protocol, but they could not argue with a massive reduction in the death rate that was already visible on the situation maps. The logic of the battlefield prevailed over the logic of the rulebook. The 28,000 lives saved became a political shield that no prosecutor dared to penetrate. Consequently, the threat of court-martial evaporated, replaced by a sullen permission to continue. Dunkelman left the meeting with his career intact, returning immediately to the convoys that were still running. He had survived the command tent, but the real vindication wasn't in the paperwork or the grudging approval of his superiors. It was waiting for him in the survivors' experience. For the survivors, the vindication of Dunkelman's methods was not found in statistical tables, but in the sudden, shocking restoration of their humanity. Hadassah Rosensaft, a survivor who later became a prominent voice for the camp's memory, described the evacuation as a transit between two distinct universes. In the filth of Bergen-Belsen, prisoners were dying with full stomachs because the rampant disease prevented their bodies from absorbing even the highest quality rations. The food sat uselessly in their systems, while typhus consumed them from the inside. However, the environment in the satellite camps broke this lethal cycle immediately. Upon arrival at the converted cavalry barracks, German nurses working under strict Allied supervision spent 30 minutes cleaning each patient. They scrubbed away months of accumulated filth, a layer of grime that had served as a protected habitat for the typhus-carrying lice. This act of hygiene physically removed the vector of the disease. Once clean, the patients were placed in beds with exactly 3 feet of separation on all sides. This geometric gap was the most critical medicine of all. It prevented the cross-contamination of fluids and parasites, which meant that a patient's recovery was no longer sabotaged by their neighbor's illness. The atmosphere inside the wards underwent a total sensory inversion. The heavy, sweet stench of rotting flesh that hung over the main camp vanished, replaced by the sharp, stinging smell of medical antiseptic. To the survivors, this chemical scent was the first signal that professional order had returned to their world. In this stabilized environment, the regimented 1,200-calorie recovery diet finally began to work. Bodies that were warm, clean, and resting in their own private space began to metabolize the energy required to heal. As a result of these environmental changes, The death rate plummeted. The daily toll dropped from the catastrophic baseline of 400 down to a range of 50 to 80 deaths per day across the entire network. This represented an 85% reduction in mortality, a massive shift achieved not by discovering a new drug, but by applying the logistics of space and hygiene. The silence of the mass grave was replaced by the quiet murmur of people learning to live again. By the end of the 8th day, the numbers confirmed what the survivors already felt in their lungs and on their skin. The impossible operation had worked. The engines of the 187 commandeered vehicles finally cooled on the evening of the 8th day, marking the end of the frantic relocation effort. Dunkelman's unauthorized logistics corps had successfully relocated 34,000 people, a population transfer equivalent to emptying a major town, completed without the catastrophic loss of life predicted by the experts. The final medical tally vindicated the risk because the mortality rate across the new network stabilized permanently between 50 and 80 deaths per day. When compared to the initial baseline of 400 to 500 daily deaths in the static camp, this reduction meant that approximately 3,400 human beings were alive at the end of the first week, who would have otherwise been buried in the mass graves. However, the official British reports filed in the wake of the victory told a sanitized version of events. The military bureaucracy absorbed the success while rejecting the unorthodox methods used to achieve it. These documents credited the dramatic drop in mortality to improved hygiene protocols and senior medical coordination, while conspicuously omitting the name of the junior Canadian officer who had actually designed the system. As a result, there were zero mentions of Ben Dunkelman in the initial administrative history of the relief effort. The system was happy to claim the lives saved, but it was unwilling to acknowledge that an infantryman had outsmarted its chief surgeons. The man himself did not fight for credit. Dunkelman returned to Canada, slipping quietly back into civilian life, without writing memoirs or seeking the spotlight. He remained silent about the trucks and the stench for decades, largely because the memory of the pit was too heavy to share with a peacetime world that wanted to celebrate victory, not discuss the logistics of mass death. He became a successful businessman and a father, burying his role in the liberation under layers of normalcy. Yet while the man disappeared into civilian obscurity, the method he invented could not be suppressed. It quietly migrated from his notebook into the official manuals of military science, where it began to rewrite the rules of war. By 1950, the Western military establishment quietly codified the hard-won lessons of Bergen-Belsen into the official NATO mass casualty evacuation protocols. This new doctrine marked a fundamental inversion of traditional medical logic because it replaced the old stabilize then transport rule with Dunkelman's move then treat imperative. The focus shifted entirely to population health, a strategic concept where the objective is to save the group by managing the environment, rather than saving the individual by managing their symptoms. The Korean War provided the first kinetic test of this doctrine later that same year. When United Nations forces faced encirclement and catastrophe during the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, they did not leave their wounded behind to stabilize. Instead, they evacuated entire field hospitals, using the mass transport model, moving thousands of freezing casualties over rough ice before attempting complex treatment. The methodology evolved further during the Vietnam War, where the technology changed, but the logic remained absolute. Helicopters became the new trucks, cutting evacuation times from hours to minutes, yet the underlying principle remained identical to the one invented in a German cavalry barrack. The speed of the vehicle had increased, but the logic of removing the patient from the danger zone before attempting surgery remained the foundation of survival. Beyond the battlefield, these ideas filtered into global humanitarian aid. The World Health Organization incorporated these logistics into their refugee guidelines, standardizing the use of decentralized satellite camps to break disease chains in civilian disasters. Consequently, every modern relief operation that spreads refugees across multiple sites to prevent epidemics is unknowingly replicating the system Dunkelman improvised in 1945. Back in Toronto, the architect of this revolution remained a ghost. For 40 years, Ben Dunkelman refused to speak about the war to his family or his business partners. He lived a quiet, successful life because the burden of what he had seen in the camps was too heavy to unpack for a polite society that wanted to believe in clean victories. He let the world believe the official history which credited the British medical establishment for the miracle. However, the truth could not remain buried forever. It took 4 decades for the survivors to find the man who saved them, revealing the final lesson of the story. The silence held until the 1980s when the survivors of Bergen-Belsen began to organize reunions and share their testimonies with a new generation. They did not speak of the British generals or the medical protocols. Instead, they asked for the young Canadian officer who had defied the doctors to give them space and air. Their collective memory forced the history books to open a new chapter, leading to a belated search for the man who had engineered their survival. In 1997, the State of Israel finally officially recognized Ben Dunkelman for his role in the liberation. This honor came more than half a century after the events, highlighting how long the world had ignored the logistical miracle he performed. In contrast, his own country remained reticent. The official Canadian military history of the war granted him only one sentence, a brief footnote that failed to capture the magnitude of saving a city's worth of people. This delayed recognition reveals the true antagonist of the story, which was never the British medical staff, but the comfort of orthodoxy. The doctors who opposed Dunkelman were not incompetent men. They were highly trained professionals who failed because they prioritized the safety of the rulebook over the reality of the crisis. They sought refuge in established procedure, believing that following the correct steps would absolve them of responsibility for the lethal outcome. Dunkelman succeeded because he rejected this professional shelter. He understood that in an unprecedented disaster, the correct choice is often the one that gets people killed, while the reckless choice is the only path to life. The legacy of those 8 days in April is visible today in the 34,000 futures that exist only because one underdog trusted his own eyes over the manual. These survivors went on to have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, creating a generational tree that now numbers in the hundreds of thousands. They are living proof that competence is not about knowing the rules, but about knowing when to break them. Ben Dunkelman died in 1997, shortly after receiving his due. But his lesson remains the most important tool in the humanitarian arsenal. It teaches us that when the system fails, the individual must act, even if it means standing alone against the experts to drive a truck through the gates of hell.